The winter of 1944 was not kind to the Allied forces. In the dense, snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, Hitler had launched his final, desperate gamble, a massive counteroffensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by tanks and artillery, had smashed through thinly defended American lines, creating a bulging salient that threatened to split the Allied armies in two. Entire divisions were encircled, supply lines were cut, panic rippled through the command structure. The weather was brutal. Freezing rain, impenetrable fog, and snowstorms that grounded air support and turned roads into rivers of ice and mud. This was Hitler's last throw of the dice, a calculated risk designed to recapture the strategic port of Antwerp, divide the British and American forces, and potentially force a negotiated peace in the West before the Soviet steamroller crushed Germany from the east. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced the most critical decision of his career. The German breakthrough had created chaos. American forces were scattered, disorganized, and in some cases, simply running. The Third Army, under the command of General George S. Patton, Jr., was engaged in a completely different operation 200 miles to the south, battering against the German defenses along the Saar River. Eisenhower needed a miracle. He needed someone who could disengage from active combat, pivot an entire army 90 degrees, march through winter storms, and strike the southern flank of the German Bulge with such speed and ferocity that it would stop the Nazi advance in its tracks. He needed Patton. But what Eisenhower was about to ask was considered militarily impossible. Modern warfare doesn't work like chess pieces sliding across a board. An army is a living organism, tens of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, endless supply columns, communication networks, artillery batteries, fuel depots, field hospitals, and coordination mechanisms that take weeks to establish. To move an entire army in winter, under combat conditions, across damaged infrastructure, and have it arrive combat-ready to attack a fortified enemy position was a logistical nightmare that violated every principle of military planning. Most generals would require at least 2 weeks, probably 3, to accomplish such a maneuver. Eisenhower knew this, his staff knew this, but Patton was not most generals. When Eisenhower convened his emergency meeting on December 19, 1944, the atmosphere was thick with tension and barely concealed fear. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was present, as was General Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior and commander of the 12th Army Group. The room was filled with maps covered in red arrows showing German penetrations. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. The Germans were advancing faster than anyone had anticipated. American casualties were mounting. The strategic situation was deteriorating by the hour. Eisenhower, normally calm and diplomatic, was visibly stressed. This was not just a tactical setback. This was a potential catastrophe that could prolong the war by months or even years. Patton entered the room with his characteristic swagger, ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, highly polished helmet reflecting the dim light. While others saw disaster, Patton saw opportunity. He had studied the terrain. He had anticipated German intentions. He had already, without orders and against standing protocols, begun preliminary planning for exactly this scenario. Some called it precessions. Others called it insubordination. Patton called it being prepared. He understood something fundamental that many of his contemporaries did not. Warfare is not a linear progression of cause and effect. It is chaos, and the commander who can impose order on that chaos fastest wins. Eisenhower laid out the situation with brutal honesty. The Germans had achieved complete tactical surprise. American forces in the Ardennes were on the verge of collapse. The entire Allied strategic position in Western Europe was at risk. He needed the Third Army to disengage from its current operations, turn north, and attack the southern flank of the German Bulge. But before he could finish outlining the enormity of the task, Patton interrupted. "When do you want me to attack?" he asked, his voice sharp, confident, almost eager. The room went silent. Eisenhower stared at him. "As soon as possible," he replied carefully. Patton pulled out a small notebook, glanced at it, and said something that would become legendary in military history. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Some staff officers laughed, thinking it was a joke. Others looked at Patton as if he had lost his mind. Bradley, who knew Patton better than anyone, felt his stomach drop. Montgomery, never one to hide his disdain for American generals he considered reckless cowboys, made a dismissive gesture. Even Eisenhower, who had immense respect for Patton's abilities, looked skeptical. What Patton was proposing was not just difficult, it was theoretically impossible. It would require moving 133,000 men, 11,000 vehicles, and all their supporting infrastructure 200 miles north through the worst winter weather in decades across roads that were barely passable, all while maintaining operational security so the Germans wouldn't detect the movement. And not just move them, but have them arrive ready to immediately launch a coordinated attack against a heavily fortified enemy position. No army in history had ever accomplished such a feat in such a time frame. But Patton wasn't bluffing. He had already done the impossible work. For days, possibly weeks, he had been quietly preparing contingency plans, moving supplies, pre-positioning units, and establishing alternative communication networks. He had anticipated this exact scenario and had taken the extraordinary risk of diverting resources and attention from his current mission to prepare for something that might never happen. In any other army, this would have been career-ending insubordination. But Patton understood something profound about warfare. The commander who waits for orders is always too late. Initiative is everything. Speed is everything. The ability to act while your enemy is still reacting is the difference between victory and defeat.
What happened in the next 48 hours would redefine the boundaries of military possibility. While Eisenhower's staff scrambled to coordinate logistics and Montgomery argued for a more cautious, methodical approach, Patton had already left the meeting and was on the phone with his subordinate commanders. The orders were simple, brutal, and uncompromising. Turn the entire Third Army north and do it now. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. Every division, every tank battalion, every artillery regiment, every supply truck was to pivot 90 degrees and move toward the town of Bastogne, where American forces were surrounded and fighting for survival. The operation was codenamed Cobra, and it would become the largest, fastest military maneuver in modern warfare history. But the reality of what Patton was asking cannot be understated. This wasn't just moving men from point A to point B. Modern armies are sustained by impossibly complex logistical networks. A single armored division consumes hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel per day. Artillery batteries fire thousands of shells per engagement. Soldiers require food, medical supplies, ammunition, winter clothing, and shelter. Communication networks need to be established and maintained. Intelligence reports must flow continuously. Maintenance crews must keep vehicles operational despite sub-zero temperatures that freeze engine oil and crack metal. And all of this must happen while German forces are actively trying to kill you. Patton's staff officers, hardened veterans who had fought across North Africa, Sicily, and France, were stunned by the scope of the task. Colonel Halley Maddox, Patton's chief logistics officer, later recalled that when he received the orders, his first thought was that Patton had finally lost his mind. The weather alone made large-scale movement nearly impossible. Roads were coated in black ice, bridges had been destroyed by German demolitions, fog was so thick that visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. Air reconnaissance was impossible, radio communications were unreliable. And yet Patton was demanding that 3 entire divisions, the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division, covering roughly 133,000 men and thousands of vehicles, execute a complex wheeling maneuver in the middle of winter and arrive combat-ready to attack one of the most battle-hardened armies in history. But Patton had prepared for this. In the weeks leading up to the Battle of the Bulge, he had quietly violated standard operating procedures and begun stockpiling supplies along potential routes north. He had pre-positioned fuel dumps, ammunition caches, and medical stations at strategic crossroads. He had ordered his intelligence officers to map every viable road, every bridge, every choke point between his current position and the Ardennes. He had conducted tabletop exercises with his division commanders, walking through hypothetical scenarios where they would need to rapidly redeploy. All of this was done with Eisenhower's knowledge, with Bradley's approval, and certainly without requisitioning the necessary resources through proper channels. Patton had stolen, bartered, intimidated, and in some cases simply taken what he needed. It was borderline criminal. It was also genius. The psychological dimension of Patton's leadership cannot be ignored. He was not just a tactician or a logistician. He was a master of human psychology and organizational behavior. He understood that armies move not just on fuel and ammunition, but on morale, confidence, and the belief that their commander knows what he's doing. While other generals would have spent days reassuring their staff, building consensus and carefully managing expectations, Patton did the opposite. He projected absolute certainty. He radiated confidence. He made it clear that failure was not an option and that anyone who couldn't keep up would be relieved of command immediately. This wasn't cruelty. This was leadership stripped to its evolutionary essence. In moments of existential crisis, organizations don't need empathy. They need direction. The movement began on the night of December 19th. Under cover of darkness and terrible weather, American columns began their northward march. Tank commanders navigated by compass and instinct. Infantry units marched through knee-deep snow. Supply trucks skidded on ice, crashed through guardrails, and in some cases simply drove off roads into ditches and were immediately abandoned as the columns pressed forward. Patton had given orders that nothing would slow the advance. Disabled vehicles were to be pushed off the road. Stragglers would be left behind. Rest stops were measured in minutes, not hours. Hot meals were forgotten luxuries. Men ate cold rations while marching. They slept in moving vehicles. Frostbite became endemic. Exhaustion was universal. And still, they moved. What makes this operation particularly remarkable was the complete absence of German intelligence about it. Hitler's reconnaissance units, normally efficient and thorough, detected nothing. The Luftwaffe, despite occasional breaks in the weather, never spotted the massive American redeployment. German ground forces had no idea that an entire army was bearing down on their southern flank. Patton had achieved complete operational surprise through a combination of aggressive counterintelligence, radio silence, and the simple fact that what he was doing was considered so impossible that the Germans didn't even look for it. German commanders, quite reasonably, assumed that any Allied response would take at least 2 weeks to organize. They had that much time. They could consolidate their gains, fortify positions, and prepare for a deliberate Allied counterattack. They were wrong. By December 21st, just 48 hours after Patton's promise at Versailles, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division made contact with German forces south of Bastogne. The shock was total. German commanders initially thought they were facing reconnaissance units or scattered remnants of retreating American forces. They couldn't conceive that an entire armored division, fully supplied and ready for combat, could appear so quickly. Their intelligence had failed catastrophically. Within hours, Patton's forces were punching holes in German defensive lines. Artillery batteries that had been positioned to fire north suddenly found themselves under attack from the south. German supply columns, moving freely just days before, were now being ambushed and destroyed. The entire southern flank of the German offensive was collapsing. Back at headquarters, Bradley received the initial combat reports and experienced something close to cognitive dissonance. He knew Patton. He had served with him for years. He understood that Patton was capable of extraordinary things. But this transcended extraordinary. This was something else entirely. When he finally reached Patton by radio and confirmed that the Third Army was not just in position but actively engaging German forces 200 miles from where they had been 3 days earlier, Bradley allegedly uttered the words that would become iconic. "He's where?" The disbelief in his voice was absolute. Even knowing Patton's capabilities, even having seen his previous operations, Bradley could barely process what had just occurred. Patton had not just met an impossible deadline, he had shattered every assumption about what modern armies could do.
The psychological impact of Patton's arrival on the German command structure was immediate and devastating. For days, Hitler and his generals had been operating under the assumption that they controlled the tempo of the battle. They had achieved surprise, they had momentum, they were dictating terms. American forces were reacting defensively, scrambling to contain the breakthrough, bleeding units piecemeal into a deteriorating situation. German intelligence had calculated that any coordinated Allied counteroffensive would require at least 10 to 14 days to organize, time that would allow them to consolidate territorial gains, establish defensive positions, and potentially negotiate from a position of strength. That calculation, reasonable by every standard metric of military operations, had just been obliterated. When reports began filtering up the German chain of command that a major American armored force was attacking from the south, the initial response was dismissal. Junior officers reporting contact with what appeared to be an entire division were accused of panic, of misidentifying scattered units, of exaggerating enemy strength. But as more reports came in, verified by multiple sources, accompanied by casualty counts and captured prisoners who identified themselves as members of the Third Army, the magnitude of the disaster became undeniable. Patton had done something that violated German operational doctrine, something that their own general staff considered impossible. He had moved an entire army, in winter, under combat conditions, faster than the Germans believed physics and logistics would allow. This had profound strategic consequences. German commanders who had been aggressively pushing north, confident in their operational security and believing they had time to exploit their breakthrough, suddenly found themselves fighting in two directions. Units that had been tasked with offensive operations were hastily redeployed to defensive positions. Supply convoys that had been moving forward to support the advance were diverted to reinforce the southern flank. Artillery batteries were repositioned. Reserve units were committed prematurely. The entire operational rhythm of the German offensive was disrupted.
What had been a coordinated, methodical advance devolved into reactive chaos. Patton had seized the initiative, and in warfare, initiative is worth more than numerical superiority, better equipment, or advantageous terrain combined. But beyond tactics and strategy, what Patton accomplished reveals something deeper about the nature of military leadership and the psychological architecture of command. Warfare, at its core, is not about weapons or technology. It's about imposing your will on the enemy faster than they can respond. It's about creating situations where your opponent's decision-making process collapses under the weight of events they can't process quickly enough. Patton understood this intuitively. He knew that speed creates confusion, confusion creates hesitation, and hesitation creates opportunity. By appearing where he was impossible to be, when he was impossible to be there, he didn't just attack German positions. He attacked German confidence, German planning, and German morale. The relief of Bastogne on December 26, 1944, became the defining moment of this operation. The town, strategically critical and desperately defended by the 101st Airborne Division under the command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had been surrounded by German forces for days. McAuliffe's famous response to German surrender demands, a single word, nuts, had become a symbol of American defiance. But symbols don't stop tanks, and the defenders were running out of ammunition, medical supplies, and time. When the 4th Armored Division, spearheaded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' Tank Battalion, broke through German encirclements and established a corridor into Bastogne, it wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological turning point in the entire Western European campaign. The images of American tanks rolling into Bastogne, greeted by exhausted but jubilant paratroopers, became iconic. But what's often forgotten in popular retellings is the sheer brutality of the fighting that made that breakthrough possible. Patton's forces didn't elegantly maneuver around German positions, they smashed through them. Artillery barrages pulverized defensive lines. Tank columns rolled over hastily constructed obstacles. Infantry assaults were conducted with a ferocity that shocked even hardened German veterans. Patton had given explicit orders: speed over caution, aggression over preservation of force. Units were expected to attack continuously, day and night, until they broke through or were destroyed trying. Casualties were high, equipment losses were significant, but the mission was accomplished. Bradley's reaction to Patton's success was complex, layered with professional admiration and personal frustration. Bradley was methodical, careful, deeply concerned with logistics and sustainability. He planned operations with precision, minimized risks, and preferred overwhelming force applied systematically. Patton was his opposite in almost every way: impulsive, aggressive, willing to gamble, and seemingly indifferent to conventional wisdom about what was possible. Their relationship was defined by this tension. Bradley respected Patton's abilities, but was constantly concerned that Patton would overextend, make a catastrophic error, and potentially derail the entire Allied campaign. The Battle of the Bulge vindicated Patton completely and forced Bradley to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, conventional military wisdom is wrong. When Bradley finally made direct contact with Patton after the breakthrough to Bastogne, the conversation was brief and revealing. Bradley, still processing the operational miracle he had just witnessed, asked Patton how he had done it. Patton's response was characteristically blunt: "I didn't wait for permission. I prepared for what needed to happen and then made it happen." This encapsulates Patton's entire command philosophy. He operated on the edge of insubordination constantly, making decisions that technically required higher authorization, committing resources he didn't officially control, and taking risks that could have ended his career. But he was almost always right. His instincts, honed by years of study, combat experience, and an almost obsessive focus on military history, allowed him to see opportunities that others missed and execute plans that others considered impossible. The German response to Patton's intervention was telling. Hitler, who had micromanaged the Ardennes offensive down to battalion-level movements, ordered immediate counterattacks against the Third Army's advance. He diverted forces that had been designated for the push toward Antwerp, weakening the main German thrust and effectively admitting that Patton's flanking maneuver had become the primary threat. German commanders on the ground, who had been confident in their ability to hold American forces at bay for weeks, now found themselves in a desperate defensive struggle against an enemy who seemed to be everywhere at once. Within days, the German offensive had stalled completely. By early January, it was in full retreat. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, had failed, and Patton's impossible maneuver was the decisive factor.
The long-term implications of Patton's maneuver at the Battle of the Bulge extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. What he accomplished in those 48 hours fundamentally altered Allied strategic thinking for the remainder of the war and influenced military doctrine for generations afterward. The operation demonstrated that with proper preparation, aggressive leadership, and a willingness to accept calculated risk, armies could move and operate at speeds previously considered impossible. It shattered the assumption that modern mechanized warfare was inherently slow and methodical. It proved that the human element, leadership, morale, initiative, could overcome supposedly insurmountable logistical constraints. And perhaps most importantly, it showed that audacity, when backed by competence, could achieve results that caution never would. But the personal cost of this achievement is rarely discussed.
The men of the Third Army who executed Patton's impossible orders paid dearly. Frostbite casualties were staggering. Thousands of soldiers suffered permanent damage to fingers, toes, and extremities from the brutal conditions. Vehicle crews worked in sub-zero temperatures, without adequate cold weather gear, stripping skin off frozen metal as they performed emergency repairs. Infantry units marched until men literally collapsed from exhaustion and had to be left behind with minimal medical attention. The psychological toll was immense. Combat fatigue, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, afflicted substantial portions of the force. Patton demanded everything from his men, and they gave it, but the cost in human suffering was enormous. Patton himself was unapologetic about these sacrifices. He operated from a brutal calculation that has always defined military leadership: the suffering of the few to save the many. Had the Third Army not arrived when it did, the German offensive might have succeeded in splitting Allied forces, prolonging the war by months or even years, resulting in exponentially greater casualties. From Patton's perspective, the frostbite, exhaustion, and trauma inflicted on his soldiers during those 48 hours prevented far worse outcomes. This is the cold mathematics of warfare that civilian observers often struggle to accept. Sometimes the most humane decision is the one that appears most brutal in the immediate term. The relationship between Patton and Bradley never fully recovered from this episode. Bradley had always been uncomfortable with Patton's methods, his flamboyance, his disregard for protocol, and his tendency to create political problems. But the Battle of the Bulge forced Bradley to confront the fact that in moments of existential crisis, conventional leadership might not be enough. The generals who followed the rules, who respected logistical timelines, who moved cautiously and preserved their forces, they would have arrived too late. Bastogne would have fallen. The German breakthrough might have succeeded. The entire Allied campaign could have been derailed. Patton, who broke rules constantly, who gambled recklessly, and who demanded the impossible from his men, had saved the situation. Bradley understood this intellectually, but it disturbed him deeply. It suggested that perhaps the military establishment's emphasis on planning, caution, and methodical execution was fundamentally wrong in certain circumstances. Eisenhower's response was more nuanced. He recognized Patton's genius, but also understood the danger of having commanders who operated outside established chains of command. The Allied coalition was a delicate political construct, requiring constant negotiation between American, British, and other national interests. Patton's lone wolf approach, while militarily effective, created diplomatic nightmares. Eisenhower spent enormous political capital protecting Patton from consequences that would have ended any other officer's career. But he also recognized that Patton represented something irreplaceable, a combat leader who could inspire men to achieve the impossible, who understood operational warfare at an almost instinctive level, and who possessed the moral courage to make decisions that others would shy away from. The German perspective on Patton's maneuver is equally revealing. After the war, captured German generals were extensively debriefed by Allied intelligence officers. When asked about the Battle of the Bulge and what went wrong, many pointed specifically to Patton's intervention as the turning point. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded the overall operation, later stated that the appearance of the Third Army on the southern flank was the moment we knew the offensive had failed. German operational planning had been meticulous, accounting for Allied responses, weather conditions, and logistical constraints. But it had not accounted for Patton, for a commander willing to do what doctrine said was impossible, for an army capable of sustained operations beyond what human endurance should allow. This raises profound questions about military leadership and the nature of warfare itself. Patton's success suggests that doctrine, while useful as a framework, can become a prison if applied too rigidly. Armies that operate strictly according to established procedures become predictable. Predictability in warfare is often fatal. The commander who can break the expected pattern, who can impose a new rhythm on the battlefield faster than the enemy can adapt, gains a decisive advantage. But this requires a specific type of personality, someone willing to accept personal responsibility for catastrophic failure, someone indifferent to criticism and conventional opinion, someone driven by an almost pathological need to win at any cost. These are not qualities that large bureaucratic organizations typically reward or even tolerate. In the decades since World War II, military historians and strategists have studied Patton's maneuver at the Battle of the Bulge as a case study in operational excellence. It appears in staff college curricula at military academies worldwide. Officers are taught the principles that made it possible: anticipatory planning, aggressive initiative, acceptance of risk, and the psychological dimension of leadership. But what's often lost in these academic analyses is the human reality, the specific, unrepeatable combination of personality, circumstance, and desperation that made it possible. Patton was not a role model for sustainable leadership. He was a necessary monster, the kind of commander you needed in moments of existential crisis, but struggled to control in peacetime. The final irony is that Patton's greatest victory also sealed his eventual marginalization. After the war ended, the Allied command structure had no place for someone like him. His methods, while effective, were too disruptive. His personality, while charismatic in combat, was a political liability in occupation and reconstruction. Eisenhower, who became Supreme Commander of NATO and eventually President of the United States, represented a different model of military leadership: diplomatic, consensus-building, politically astute. Patton, who died in a car accident in December 1945, never had to navigate the complexities of the post-war world.
He remained frozen in time as the general who did the impossible, who appeared 200 miles behind enemy lines when no one believed it could be done, who broke the back of Hitler's last offensive through sheer force of will. When Bradley received that initial report confirming Patton's position, when he uttered those incredulous words, "He's where?" he was expressing something more than surprise. He was witnessing the collision between conventional military thinking and a form of operational genius that doesn't fit neatly into doctrinal frameworks. He was seeing the limits of his own approach exposed, and he was realizing, perhaps uncomfortably, that sometimes the rules exist to be broken, that sometimes the impossible is merely the difficult executed with sufficient determination, and sometimes the most reckless gamble is the only rational choice. Patton understood this. It made him brilliant, it made him dangerous, and in December 1945, it made him indispensable.